Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In part 3 of his work Ressentiment, Max Scheler is going to discuss some really important shifts that take place in the very conception of God, understood in capital G sense as the creator of the universe, whatever it is that is the highest power, particularly in relation to love. And he says that genuine Christianity is part of how this comes about. So you could think of this as some of the determinate contribution that Christianity is making within the realm of ideas, but also, as he's going to point out, within the way people live out their lives of commitments, of values, of thinking about matters of community. So the first thing that he's going to talk about in this particular discussion is the metaphysical religious conceptions of human beings' relations to God. And so we are not, finding this emerging in a vacuum, right? There's a contrast here between an old covenant between God and human being, which he says is the root of all legality, replaced by a different paradigm, that of the love between God and his children. So it's not simply that God, as we're going to see, is love and, loves his children or its children, however we want to conceptualize God. And, human beings then are just sort of, the recipients of this. There's actually a between relationship here. We're called upon to love God as love. And so he's going to say the love for God is not just founded on his works alone. And notice that he's going to talk about this term gratitude, right? We're going to come back to that in a moment. So he says, experiences of God's actions and works are meant to make us look to eternal love and to the, as he's going to call it, the infinite abundance of value of which these works are but the proof. They, the works, should be admired and loved only because they are the works of love. So love itself is the priority, it's the act, it's the value, and we could call it economy of actions going back and forth between human beings and this infinite God is sort of the effect of that. So this leads to another interesting paradigm. And, this is well worth thinking about in an era when the notion of gratitude is very, very big in pop culture, all the way from the, most hippie, new agey people on the left, all the way over to Christians and other people on the right and everything in between, an attitude of gratitude. Nothing wrong with gratitude. Scheler is not saying that it's bad, but it's not the absolute value that so many people make it out to be. So he says, the love for God is not to be founded on his works alone, in gratitude for his constant gifts, his care, and his maintenance. It's good to feel gratitude for that, but that's not the main point. He goes on and he says that, the gratitude itself is, yes, important, but that, we should be recognizing the meaningfulness, the value of love itself. And so he brings up Hugo de Saint Victor and this soliloquy on the earnest money of the soul, referring to a love which is founded only on God's works and good deeds as love like a whore, right? And he says, we find this strict opposition to the idea of the covenant, an idea which contains the germs of that love based on gratitude, which typifies what Scheler is going to call average religiosity. We should not love God because of his heaven and earth. We should love heaven and earth because they are God's, because they adumbrate, they show us kind of a shadow of eternal love by means of sensible expression rather than as a purposive idea. So this contextualizes gratitude, making gratitude into something that is not bad, but is also not what it's all about. So we should be loving God because God is love itself. And we get a really key idea being worked out here. Love has its origin in God himself, the infinite being. And we can go even further. It's not just that love is something that comes out of God. God remains a mystery. And we register it through love. We're like one step away from God. He goes on further and he says, God is love, right? God is infinite love and mercy. And so this is like a revelation of the nature of what God is and about love itself, as we've seen talked about a little bit earlier. And there are some important implications that he's going to draw from this. He's not going to draw every single possible implication. He's going to zero in on one that's particularly striking when it comes to traditional Christian morality, which, by the way, many Christians in the present aren't actually living out, practicing, talking about. They're doing something quite different, right? So he says that genuine love transcending the natural sphere is manifested most clearly when we love our enemy. It's not that it's only manifested in loving one's enemy. It's manifested most clearly when we do that. And he says that there's a change, there's a movement away from a previous way of looking at things. How did the ancients typically look at this? Love the good and the just, hate the evil and the unjust. And you see this in not only the Hebrew writings, right? And it's sometimes very clearly there, but also Greek philosophy, also ancient tragedy. We could go on and on and on. This is a pervasive idea. Cicero talks about this in On Duties, right? We shouldn't be loving or showing beneficence to people who are scumbags. We should save that for the people who actually deserve it. But Christianity says, no, you have to love everybody, right? Why? Well, because that is what God actually does, loving both the good and the bad, the just and sinners, one's friends and one's enemies. So we have a different paradigm for how love is supposed to be distributed. And this allows love to transcend the, as he calls it, the natural sphere. And then we get a very interesting contrast being drawn here as well. The God of, you could call it the God of the philosophers if you want, but in a way it's the God of antiquity. The God of Greek metaphysics, he says, is the ideal of the sage. Now, what's the sage? The sage is the wise person idealized, so like the best wise person ever in ancient thought, in ancient poetry, philosophy. And, there's discussions about whether the sage actually exists or not. And of course, each philosophical school views them somewhat differently. But the sage is supposed to be detached, above it all. And that's the way a lot of people thought of God back then, right? A logical egoist, being closed in itself, self-observing and self-thinking. And he brings up this phrase from Aristotle, noesis, noeseos, right? There's mind thinking itself, who cares little about the course of earthly events and is not truly responsible for the world. By contrast, the Christian deity, the Christian God, is a personal God who created the world. Okay, so far so good. Why did he create the world? Was it out of necessity? Was it out of lack, need, loneliness? No, it's out of a superabundance. And this is love. Created the world out of an infinite overflow of love, not because he wanted to help anyone or anything, for nothing existed before, but only to express this superabundance of love. And there's a really interesting observation that he's going to close this discussion with, and I think it's very important. This new notion of God, he says, is the conceptual theological expression of what? A changed attitude towards life. So if you don't actually live this out, at least to some degree, then you could say, well, it's nice that you have different ideas, but it doesn't really matter now, does it? It's a changed attitude towards life, towards one's own life, towards others' lives, towards life in general, a different valuation that is going to play itself out depending on what sort of conception of God you have. If you think of God as love itself, as, infinite love, well, then you have a very different conception of God than the other ones that it is being contrasted against. And Scheler takes this as sort of typical of genuine, as opposed to fake, Christianity.